Hello, online learners. Part 3 of biological molecules is lipids or fats. Now, quite often when we talk about nutrition, fats are bad, but in your body, you do need some fat. Not a lot, but you do need some fat. So when we look at the molecule or the biological molecules note page, what we're going to do is we're going to do part 3 now, and we're going to look at lipids. I want you to pay attention to the structure, the function, and examples. And there's 3 different categories of lipids we will be looking at. So let's look over at the same series of videos to give you an idea of lipids.
Lipids are a group of hydrophobic biomolecules that play important roles in living organisms. While the primary function of lipids is long-term energy storage, lipids are also used for protection, insulation, and lubrication. They also act as precursors for some hormones and are a key component of cell membranes.
Okay, so when we are looking at the sources, the function of lipids, energy storage, adipose is very important for storing energy. Also protection. There's a little bit of fat protection on your hands and feet for protection. Insulation is very important especially if you're something like a whale or a seal, which you want to keep the heat in. Then lubrication is, we're going to look a little bit about how the lipids will allow things to slide better, especially in things like the pleural cavity, which is the cavity between the membranes around your lungs. Hormone precursors are important because we're going to look at something called steroids, and cell membranes where we look at something called a phospholipid. So there's 3 categories of lipids, and we may have heard, you may be aware of fat. And there's actually 4, but we're not going to look at waxes because in the human body, the only place waxes is important is in your ears. And really, it's not that important in this class.
There are 4 basic groups of lipids. These are triglycerides, phospholipids, steroids, and waxes.
Okay, as I said, triglycerides are the fats that you think about when you're talking about your food. Phospholipids are very important in membranes, and steroids are precursors. So again, pay attention to the function and also the structure, because these structures are very important in terms of a term we've heard already is hydrophobic. So that means it does not interact with water. Okay? Properties.
These groups differ in many respects. They all have one characteristic in common. They are all insoluble in water. You may have noticed that lipids and water do not mix. For example, notice the yellow-colored oil in the beaker of water shown here?
Okay, you know that lipids and they don't mix. So when we look at triglycerides, the first category, we are going to look at what are called fats and oils.
Triglycerides include the fats and oils. Fats, such as lard and butter, are solid at room temperature and are used by animals for insulation, protection, and long-term energy storage. Oils, such as corn oil and olive oil, are liquid at room temperature and are used by plants for long-term energy storage.
Okay, triglycerides are fats and oils, and they actually have a very unique chemical property. And when you look at them, so lipids have only carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen in them, but it's the way that it interacts that gives these fats these specific properties. So here we have a 3-carbon backbone called glycerol, and then tri means 3. So here are the 3 fatty acids that come off of triglycerides. Now, when you change the fatty acid, you will change the property of the fat or the oil. And that'll be something to look at later in terms of nutrition, but not needed in this class. Now, look at how the carbon and hydrogen is bonded And if you imagine these little hydrogens pulling the electrons, everything is pulled in exactly equal and opposite. So as a result, you have the sharing of electrons are very similar, very non-unequal. So they're all equal. And as a result, you have a non-polar molecule. And it's this non-polar molecule that will not react with polar water. And this is why fats will not mix with water and will float on the top. Or since it doesn't mix, it's scared of it, or it's hydrophobic. And we'll look at that a lot when we look at different properties of fats and oils. Now, there's little differences. You can have something called an unsaturated fat, which has a double bond. You can have a saturated fat, which has a single bond, so it's all saturated. Anyway, it's a little more than we need to know, but you can read about that later. So this is a triglyceride because you have 3. Now, if we take the triglyceride and we change one of the fatty acids out and replace it with a phospho group, we end up with something called a phospholipid, group number 2. Now, phospholipids have this really unique head and tail.
Phospholipids are similar to triglycerides in that they contain glycerol and 2 fatty acids. What's different is that a phosphate group, rather than a third fatty acid, is attached to the third carbon of glycerol.
Okay, because we have changed that long non-polar fatty acid with a phosphate group, we now have a charged end. And this charged end will interact with water. And this is very important because this end is hydrophilic, water-loving, and the bottom is hydrophobic. And that's what makes these into membranes.
Phospholipids are extremely important, mainly because of their unique properties in regard to water. The phosphate head of the molecule is hydrophilic, or water-loving. This means that it mixes well with water. The fatty acid tails, however, are hydrophobic, or water-hating, and do not mix well with water. Because of these unique properties, phospholipids tend to arrange themselves so that only the hydrophilic heads interact with the watery environment, and the hydrophobic tails crowd inward away from the water.
When we look at membranes, this hydrophilic and hydrophobic is very important. So you will create a double phosphate phospholipid bilayer, which we'll talk about when we talk about the membranes. Very important. And the last group we're going to look at is steroids.
Steroids are the next category of lipids. Steroids are composed of 4 fused rings of carbon to which different functional groups are attached.
Okay, let's look at the structure of steroids. Now, on each corner, there is a carbon molecule. So these are very large molecules and, again, rather non-polar because it's just a lot of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen shared equally.
One well-known steroid molecule is cholesterol. Cholesterol serves as a precursor for the synthesis of other steroids such as testosterone, estrogen, vitamin D, and cortisone.
Okay, so when we talk about fats and steroid, which is fats have a category which is steroids. Steroids is the precursor to make the hormones estrogen and testosterone and cortisol. And all you're doing is changing off the groups at the end. And we don't need to go into detail as to those groups. We will look at those later on in another class.
Cholesterol is present in plasma membranes where it stabilizes the membrane.
So here we have the steroid, the 4 carbon chains which make up the steroids. And notice that all we're doing is changing the bits at the end and not a lot. Really, the only difference between estrogen and testosterone is this one bit at the end. Okay? So the functional groups are important. So take a second and summarize on your worksheet, and then I'll give you the answers. So as we're summarizing, there are three main categories. The first one is triglyceride. Hopefully you got that the structure is a glycerol backbone with 3 fatty acids coming off it. And very important is that it is very non-polar, does not react well with water. Then the function of fats is energy storage, insulation, protection, and also vitamin absorption, A, D, and E. Then examples are oils and fats like butter and lard. So that is category number 1. Category number 2 is phospholipids. Phospholipids. Okay, take a second, stop the video, and tell me about the structure, function, and examples.